It was a quiet town, the kind where people waved to their neighbors, where the biggest excitement on most days was a late-night convenience store run or a lost dog wandering too far from home. The streets were clean, the houses lined up neatly, and the sidewalks carried the footsteps of people who never thought much about what could be lurking beneath the surface of their so-called peaceful community. It was the kind of place where things were supposed to make sense, where rules were followed, where authority was respected. But on this particular afternoon, something was about to happen that would shake that quiet foundation. It began with the flashing of red and blue lights in the rearview mirror of a black SUV, a siren that should have been nothing more than routine, a simple stop, a quick check, a few questions, and then, on any other day, life would go on just as it always had. But this wasn't any other day. And this wasn't any ordinary stop. Two officers, wearing the kind of confidence that comes from knowing they hold the power in situations like this, stepped out of their patrol car. Their boots hit the pavement in practice steps, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes already scanning the vehicle. Already making assumptions about the person inside, they saw a black woman behind the wheel. They saw dark-tinted windows, a polished exterior. And in their minds, they had already decided who she was, what she was doing, why she was there. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't have known, was that the woman sitting in the driver's seat wasn't just another motorist on an afternoon drive. She wasn't a tourist passing through. She wasn't someone who would be easily intimidated by the flash of a badge, the weight of a command, or the presence of men who had done this far too many times before. She had been in situations far more dangerous than this. She had faced people with far more power, far more resources, and far less regard for the law. Her name was Maya Carter, and what these officers were about to learn, what they were about to understand far too late, was that she wasn't just another driver on the road. She was a federal agent, a woman who had spent years operating in the shadows, gathering intelligence, stopping threats before they reached the surface. A woman trained to read people in seconds, to dismantle situations before they turned deadly. A woman who knew exactly how this moment would play out, even before the first words were spoken. Maya Carter had spent her life proving people wrong. From the moment she could remember, she had been told, in one way or another, what she couldn't do, what she shouldn't dream of, what was simply not meant for her. She was raised in a world that saw her as less before she even had the chance to show who she really was. She grew up in a town where the color of her skin made her stand out in every classroom, where she was one of the few black students in a sea of faces that rarely looked like hers. She remembered the way teachers hesitated before calling on her, the way their smiles faded slightly when she raised her hand with the right answer, as if surprised that she knew it at all. She remembered the way some of them talked to her, slow and careful, as if assuming she wouldn't understand. And when she did understand, when she excelled, they either dismissed it as luck or suggested that she must have had extra help at home. It was never just her own intelligence, never just her own hard work. She learned early on that she had to be twice as good, twice as prepared, and twice as disciplined to be seen as half as capable. And she was. She pushed herself harder than anyone else, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She couldn't afford to fail. She couldn't afford to be average. Average was a luxury for others. For Maya, it meant being overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. But she refused to be forgotten. When she told her high school counselor she wanted to join the military, she was met with raised eyebrows and a doubtful chuckle. Maybe you should consider something more practical, they said, something safer, something that suits you. But Maya didn't want safe. She didn't want practical. She wanted to serve. She wanted to fight for something bigger than herself. And most of all, she wanted to prove, if not to them, then to herself, that she belonged in any room she walked into. So she enlisted, and it was there in the grueling heat of basic training, in the relentless drills, in the unforgiving discipline of the military, that she found out just how much she was capable of. She excelled faster, stronger, smarter. She outperformed recruits who had never been doubted a day in their lives. She trained harder than those who had always been told they would succeed. And yet, no matter how many times she proved herself, the looks never changed. The hesitation in their voices never faded. "You're good," they would say for a woman, for someone like you. But Maya didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. She kept her head down, did the work, and let her actions speak louder than the assumptions made about her. She climbed the ranks quickly. earning respect from those who mattered, while ignoring the ones who would never see past their own biases. Then one day, an opportunity came that she never expected, a quiet conversation in a dimly lit office, a meeting with men in suits who never wasted words. They had been watching her, they had seen her skill, they had seen her discipline. They had seen what others refused to acknowledge, that she was exceptional. "We need people like you," they told her. "People who can think on their feet, people who can blend in and stand out when necessary, people who don't crack under pressure." And just like that, her path changed. She was recruited into the CIA. It was a world she never imagined she would step into: intelligence briefings, high-stakes missions, classified operations that never made the news. She became one of the best in the field, navigating danger with the same precision and control she had mastered in every stage of her life. She operated in foreign territories, infiltrated criminal organizations, took down threats before they reached American soil. She had faced warlords, arms dealers, and some of the most dangerous men in the world, and she had won. But back home, none of that mattered, because back home, she wasn't a highly trained agent. She wasn't a decorated officer. She wasn't the woman who had spent years serving her country in the shadows. She was just another black woman in America, and no badge, no title, no level of success could erase that in the eyes of those who refused to see her for who she really was. She thought that everything she had done, everything she had achieved, would be enough to protect her from the prejudice that had followed her since childhood. She thought that her service, her loyalty, her sacrifices would make her untouchable, that the respect she had earned overseas would mean something when she was standing on her own streets, in her own country. She was wrong. Maya had been driving for hours, her mind focused on the details of the classified meeting she had just left. The conversation had been tense, filled with warnings about national threats, operations in motion, and intelligence that couldn't afford to fall into the wrong hands. But none of that mattered now, because as she glanced in her rearview mirror, her entire world narrowed down to two things: the flashing red and blue lights behind her, and the unsettling feeling in her gut. She wasn't speeding, she hadn't run a light, there was no reason to be stopped. But she knew better than to believe that mattered. She had seen it too many times before, on the news, in her own life. In the stories whispered among friends and family, a traffic stop could mean anything. Or it could mean everything. She took a slow breath, keeping her hands visible on the wheel as the patrol car rolled to a stop behind her. Two doors opened. Two men stepped out. Their movements were slow, deliberate, practiced. This wasn't new to them. This wasn't random. Sergeant Greg Turner and Officer Mike Harris. She didn't know their names yet, but she knew men like them. The way they walked, the way they squared their shoulders, the way they looked at her car, already deciding what kind of person she was before they even reached her window. They had done this before, and today they had chosen the wrong person. They tapped against glass, loud and demanding. License and registration. Maya moved with careful precision, her training kicking in. No sudden movements, no hesitation. She reached for her documents the way she had been taught since childhood, slowly, deliberately, making sure both hands were visible at all times. She handed them through the window, her voice calm, controlled. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" There was a pause, not the kind that meant they were considering an answer, but the kind that meant they hadn't expected the question, as if the reason didn't matter, as if she wasn't supposed to ask. Sergeant Turner shifted on his feet, eyes narrowing. He wasn't here to answer questions. "Step out of the vehicle." Maya didn't move, didn't blink, her heart rate steady, her expression unreadable. On what grounds? A smirk from Officer Harris, the kind of smirk that sent a clear message. She had just made this worse for herself. Refusal to comply. Step out now. She knew this game. They expected compliance, but not strength. They expected fear, but not control. They expected submission, but not knowledge, and they had no idea that the woman they were trying to intimidate could dismantle their entire careers with a single phone call. But she wasn't going to make that call, not yet, because she needed to see how far they would take this. Then, slowly, Maya reached for the door handle. "All right," she said, her voice smooth and even. "I'll step out." But she wasn't stepping out as a woman being bullied on the side of the road. She was stepping out as an agent who had spent years breaking men just like them. SGT. Turner grabbed her arm in an attempt to cuff and detain her as his grip on Maya's arm tightened, not enough to bruise, but enough to send a message, enough to remind her that, in this moment, they believed they were in control. Officer Harris stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, watching, waiting. This was routine for them, A game they had played too many times before, a game where they always held the winning hand. Maya felt the weight of their arrogance, the casual way they carried themselves, as if her presence here, or her existence, was an inconvenience, as if she was nothing more than another name on a long list of people they had bullied, intimidated, controlled. But today the rules were about to change. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," Turner scoffed, exchanging a glance with Harris, the kind of glance shared between men who had done this 100 times before, men who weren't used to being challenged, a glance filled with amusement, because in their minds, this was already over. And as chuckling, Turner tilted his head, voice dripping with mockery. "Oh yeah? And who exactly are you?" And then, for the first time, Maya smiled. "Special Agent Maya Carter, CIA." Realization didn't come all at once. It started slow. A flicker of doubt in Turner's eyes. The briefest hesitation in Harris's stance. Then, like a crack in a dam, it spread. Turner's fingers twitched slightly against her sleeve before he pulled back as if burned. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his smirk gone, replaced by something else, something he wasn't used to feeling. Maya didn't move. She didn't need to. The power had already shifted. Static-filled police radio chatter crackled to life on Harris's shoulder. The sound filled the tense air between them. "We need a supervisor." The officers said nothing. They didn't meet each other's eyes. They didn't reach for their radios, didn't reach for their cuffs, didn't do anything at all. Because for the first time, they weren't in control of the situation, and they knew it. Maya held their gaze, her expression unreadable. She had spent years studying human behavior, reading body language, knowing when a man was bluffing and when he was unraveling, and right now, both of them were unraveling fast. "What's wrong, officers?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled. Something changed. Turner swallowed hard. His face had lost its color. His hands, once so confident, were now restless. He glanced toward their patrol car as if searching for an escape. But there wasn't one. They had pulled over the wrong person, and now there was no undoing what they had done. The silence stretched, a silence filled with consequences they hadn't prepared for. Then, distant sirens growing closer fast. They knew, and she knew they knew. "If I were you," Maya said, taking a slow step forward, her eyes locked onto theirs, "I'd start thinking about what I'm going to say when the supervisor gets here." Another long pause, another beat of silence. Then, for the first time since the stop began, Turner looked down, defeated. The footage was undeniable. The confrontation, the arrogance, the fear that replaced it, all captured on the body cams, the dash cam, and Maya's own hidden recording. Within hours, the video began to spread. Within days, it became impossible to ignore. News anchors dissected every second of the footage. Analysts debated what it meant. Civil rights attorneys took notice. Activists demanded action. The public wanted justice, and for the first time in their careers, SGT, Greg Turner and Officer Mike Harris were the ones under investigation. Tonight, growing outrage over a viral traffic stop involving 2 officers with a history of misconduct. 52 formal complaints in the last 5 years. Not a single one resulted in disciplinary action. The question remains, how did these men stay on the force for so long? The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. These officers did not stop Maya Carter for a traffic violation. They stopped her because of the color of her skin, and they did so with the full confidence that nothing would happen to them. Why? Because nothing ever had. One by one, past complaints were read aloud. 52 cases, 52 times civilians had reported harassment, wrongful stops, intimidation, each one dismissed, each one ignored. How many more people suffered in silence? The attorney asked, how many people were threatened into compliance, afraid of what would happen if they fought back? She walked forward steadily, composed. This was not the battlefield she trained for. But today, it is the battlefield that matters most. She takes her oath, sits down, looks directly at the jury, and then she spoke. "I have operated in some of the most dangerous places in the world," she says, her voice unwavering. "I have gone undercover in war zones. I have tracked international criminals. I have risked my life to protect this country. But nothing prepared me for being treated like a criminal in my own home." The courtroom became silent, every eye on her, every word carrying weight. "That night, I wasn't an agent. I wasn't a soldier. I was just another black woman on the side of the road, hoping that these men wouldn't decide my life wasn't worth respecting." The jury shifts uncomfortable. The officers avoid her gaze. The tension is suffocating. Maya continues, "Lucky that I had the training to stay calm, lucky that I had the knowledge to stand my ground, lucky that I had the resources to fight back. But how many others weren't? Murmurs ripple through the courtroom. The weight of her word settles in. The prosecution rests their case, and now the world waits for justice. The air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation. A verdict was coming, a moment of reckoning. Maya sat still, her expression unreadable. The officers, once so confident, now barely looked up. Their fates hung in the balance. The judge enters. The room rises. Silence blankets the courtroom. In the case of the state versus G.T. Greg Turner and Officer Mike Harris, on the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendants. A pause. The breath of an entire nation held. Guilty. Gasps ripple through the courtroom, a shift, a release, the weight of justice finally pressing down. On the charge of racial profiling, we find the defendants. Guilty. A storm of emotions surges, relief, vindication, a small but significant step forward. The officers slump back in their seats, the badge that once gave them unchecked power now stripped away, replaced by the consequences they never thought they'd face. Effective immediately. Both officers are relieved of duty. Further sentencing will be determined at a later date. Maya exhales, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of battle won. But the war, far from over. The impact of the case rippled beyond the courtroom doors. It wasn't just two officers facing accountability. It was a system exposed for its failures. The police chief, long accused of ignoring misconduct, was forced to resign. A full internal review was launched. New policies were drafted, aimed at preventing racial discrimination in law enforcement. For the first time in years, people saw change, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Press cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Frustration. But she doesn't stop, she doesn't pose, she doesn't celebrate. She walks past the noise, past the spectacle, because this was never about attention, it was about something bigger, it was about justice. Maya never sought fame, she sought justice, and on that day she won. But how many others are still waiting for their justice? How many times has this happened without cameras rolling, without the world watching? If this story proves anything, it's that silence allows injustice to thrive, and that real change only happens when people refuse to look away. So, will you look away? If you believe in justice, if you believe in change, share this story and subscribe to our channel. Let it be heard. Because silence is what allows injustice to continue. And if you think this was shocking, wait until you hear the next story. One where the underdog fights back in a way no one saw coming. Click here to watch.